In this video, I'm going to be going over the huge amounts of layoffs that have been going on over the past probably like 2 years now. It's definitely been a topic that a lot of people have touched on, and I thought I would give my 2 cents on it because a lot of people are complaining about losing their jobs and things like that. And while it's definitely justifiable, of course, because they're losing their job, it's also you kind of have to understand the entire reason that these companies are doing it too. Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about the money, and a lot of these games that a lot of these developers are making now are just absolutely horrible, and so they don't sell well, and then they end up losing a bunch of money, so they end up firing people. And so this is an article from IGN that says, "I've never seen it this bad. Game developers explain the huge layoffs hitting Riot, Epic, and more." An estimated 10,000 game workers lost their jobs in 2023 alone. And so, yeah, I mean, the layoffs have been huge. I think a big part of it has also been because of COVID and everything. Hired a bunch of people during COVID or before COVID, and then COVID came. Everybody was working from home, and just a lot of these games that were in development. I really don't want to say it's COVID's fault that they were bad because there was some games that managed to thrive that were in development during that time. Baldur's Gate 3 being one of them, and it wasn't even technically a triple A. I mean, they definitely had some quite a bit of funding, but it wasn't. It's not like a lot of these huge developers like Blizzard and Diablo 4 and that. Yeah, it's really sad to see. I mean, a lot of this is happening because these developers are just making terrible games, and then these smaller indie developers who have way less people working on these games are making better games. So those games sell more, so they end up having a lower cost. I don't want to say lower cost basis. Their costs of production and paying their employees and stuff is so much lower because there's less people that they're not only making more from selling more copies as opposed to these bigger companies, but they're also keeping more too because they don't have as many expenses. So this article goes on to say, in August of last year, Ascendant Studios developer Aaron, named changed for anonymity, wow, English, was ready to take a well-deserved victory lap. He had crunched hard with many of his colleagues in the final sprint to complete Ascendant's debut game, Immortals of Avium, but the team had finally done it. He attended a launch party in Bay Area where he celebrated with his colleagues, some of whom he said had to pay partially out of pocket to make the trip. While the event was supposed to be jubilant, jubilant, there was an uneasy atmosphere. It seemed like Immortals of Avium wasn't performing especially well. At the party, developers kept asking leadership how the game was doing, only to be met with non-committal answers. A few weeks later, almost half of the studio, Aaron included, had been laid off, with managers citing Immortals of Avium's underperformance. And so, yeah, this is another one of those games that it looked decent in trailers, but then, I mean, when it came out, the reviews that it got were just not all that great because, I mean, the gameplay wasn't really all that fun. It was just super flashy. There was like nothing happening really in the game. It was super short too, and they were charging, I believe, almost full price for the game. And so it's like why would people want to pay for something that's just that bad? That's really what it is. And I don't know how many people work at this Ascendant Studios, but I mean, if this game had more than 300 people working on it, I mean, even 300 people is a lot, but I mean, it was not good. It was not good. So the Ascendant Studios was just one of numerous studios that has laid off a chunk of its workforce in the last year and a half as part of the ongoing trend of mass layoffs impacting studios, large and small. There have been many attempts to answer the question of why exactly this is happening, with analysts, CEOs, and other industry experts weighing in on discussions trying to explain it. The commonly cited villain was fairly straightforward: COVID 19. Take Two CEO Strauss Zelnick actually put it quite effectively to us when he asked him about layoffs last November. With regard to the industry, I do not think people got a lot. I do think people got a little fat and happy during the pandemic, he said. I think there was a perception on the part of many that the music would never stop. I agree. During the pandemic, it was just lockdown. Everybody was working from home. They got maybe a little too comfortable just having a job that they didn't really. They had an excuse not to perform as well, I would say. And so these companies just hired on a bunch of people that would work from home. At least that's what I'm assuming because now they're getting laid off. And they just weren't doing anything. I mean, it's kind of the same thing when Elon Musk took over Twitter and fired over 50%, I believe, of Twitter. And it's still Twitter for all intents and purposes, or X, or whatever you want to call it. It just makes you wonder what any of these people are actually doing. Were they just being hired to be hired, or were they actually hired to perform a job and see it through? And so, while it is unfortunate to see a lot of people lose their jobs, it almost kind of makes you wonder like, well, maybe they lost their job because they weren't really doing enough. I'm not going to say all the people who lost their job weren't doing enough because obviously there was some who were affected by it, of course, who were actually trying to provide value in their job. But on a majority, I mean, the companies got rid of the people who were not delivering on what they were supposed to be delivering on, and that's just all there is to it. So Zelnick was stating a refrain we'd heard elsewhere. The big surge in spending during the pandemic effectively tricked a lot of companies into overspending, overhiring, overestimating. Then, when games revenues leveled back out in 2022, or as gamers left the house again, cuts had to be made. The ESA had touted this explanation, as had the IGDA. A Tencent business development director told NPR the same thing. It's a likely and understandable explanation given the havoc the pandemic wreaked everywhere. So again, it's just reaffirming that it was just a spending spree during the pandemic. They sent out those stimulus checks. Governments just keep spending money, so which naturally the more money you have, the more money you print, the less valuable it becomes. Money has inherent value because it is finite. So the closer and closer you get to just printing more and more, naturally it loses its value. It's just that's just basic science, basic everything. It's just how the world works. Why the government thinks it needs to keep just printing money is beyond. Well, I know why. It's because they really don't care about the future generations. It seems like because they just keep printing money, so they have money to just screw the generations that come after. Because there's going to be just so much money that it's going to be worth practically nothing. It says, but it isn't the entire story. Layoffs like the ones at Ascendant don't fit in with the pandemic narrative. And with over 10,000 layoffs in 2023 and over 6,000 and more in 2024, simply saying that companies got a little too eager during the global pandemic is starting to sound overly trite. Even executives are starting to sense they can't rely on this explanation, and Riot Games' public statement explaining the reasoning behind layoffs affecting 530 individuals, or 11% of all Riot Games. Riot admitted that the decisions that led to these cuts were made long before the pandemic began. So again, I wasn't saying, or I wasn't trying to say that it was the main reason, but it definitely was one of the reasons, I think. These companies just hired way too many people. I just don't see any reason that they had to have that many because again, they're the games they've been producing have just not been great, and then the games that we've seen that have done really well have had less people working there. So it's obvious that it can be done with less people. That's just all there is to it. And so the people who were just kind of just scraping by and doing the bare minimum, a lot of them got laid off. And unfortunately, there was a couple that people who were working hard that got laid off as well. But let's go ahead and see what they have to say about uh, it being predestined. Since 2019, we made a number of big bets across the company with the goal of making it better to be a player. We jumped headfirst in creating new experiences and broadening our portfolio, and grew quickly as we became a multi game, multi experience company, expanding our global footprint, changing our operating model, bringing in new talent to match our ambitions, and ultimately doubling the size of Riot in just a few years. Today, we're a company without a sharp enough focus, and simply put, we have too many things underway. Some of the significant investments we've had aren't paying off the way we expected them to. Our costs have grown to the point where they're unsustainable, and we've let ourselves with no room for experimentation or failure, which is vital to a creative company like ours. All of this puts the core of our business at risk. And see, that's been the main complaint I think from a lot of people too nowadays, is that a lot of these games that they've been releasing are just super safe. Just super safe. Like the most prime example I can think of is Blizzard and Diablo 4. I mean, Diablo 4 has just not lived up to the hype. I mean, it's a visually good looking game. The gameplay is all right, but there's just so many ARPGs out there that are just so much better. Path of Exile, Last Epoch, and a lot of other indie developed games like that that even go into more depth than Diablo 4. And so it just kind of puts things into perspective, and it's like, and plus those games are cheaper too. Like they're charging over $100 for the expansions and everything for Diablo 4, and it's like Last Epoch I think it's like $30 and it has a ton of stuff to do. Same with Path of Exile. I think Path of Exile is actually free. And so there's just those games, because there's less developers and things like that, can also just experiment more and risk, and people can at least appreciate it a little more when companies are willing to risk more. But when these companies get so big, they just, I don't know why they feel like they have to play it safe, but they do, because they don't want to lose money. And then of course, ironically, in the pursuit of not losing money, they lose money because they want to play it safe. But that's a whole different thing. And so they end up just doing just the bare bones same thing over and over. Call of Duty is another one. And so yeah, while it is unfortunate, I do agree that a lot of these companies just needed to let some people go. I also think they need to get more honed in on what they actually want to do in a specific game, and then take risks within that game instead of just producing the same thing. Because I mean, people will play the same thing. Like I myself will play Dark Souls and those games, but it is nice to have a change of pace. It is nice to mix things up, to have a new experience, because I mean, gaming is just about having fun. And if we can't have a new, solid, meaningful experience, a fun experience most of all, then what are we doing? What are we doing? And so yeah, this the article goes on. I mean, I pretty much captured the gist of it. A lot of these companies, I mean, that's over 16,000 layoffs in 2023 and 2024, and we're only what, the 12th of February of 2024 right now, so that's a lot of layoffs at the beginning of the year. But obviously it is negative for the people who lost their job, I think it is positive for games as a whole. I'm hoping that those people who did lose their jobs will be able to find ways to maybe get back into other companies, or find other things they can do within the gaming space if they're passionate about it, to then come back swinging even harder than before. And I hope these companies that did all the layoffs will be able to actually start taking greater risks again, to start making games that are better, that push boundaries, that just try new things to see in what ways they can improve, because it's getting to the point where it's just the same old, and people are just getting tired of it. So let me know what you guys think down below, if I was a little too harsh or not, what you guys think of all the layoffs and things like that. I think personally it's a net positive more than it's a net negative, but everybody has their own opinion. If you guys liked the video, make sure to leave a like, and I hope to see you guys around. Peace.